The morning sun hadn't even cleared the perfectly manicured hedges of Willowbrook Estates when Margaret Maggie Thornfield's white BMW X5 came screaming around the corner of Maple Lane at 43 miles per hour, exactly 28 miles, over the posted speed limit that she herself had lobbied to reduce from 25 to 15 just 6 months earlier. Sheriff Deputy Marcus Williams never saw it coming. The impact sent his patrol car spinning like a carnival ride, metal shrieking, against asphalt as Maggie's pristine SUV crumpled against the driver's side door. Steam hissed from both vehicles as they came to rest in what had been Mrs. Chen's award-winning rose garden. Another HOA violation that would need addressing, assuming anyone survived to write the citation. "Sweet mother of..." Deputy Williams groaned, tasting blood as he fumbled for his radio. Through his cracked windshield, he watched a perfectly coiffed woman in a powder-blue tracksuit emerge from the BMW, not stumbling, not dazed, but marching, toward him with the purposeful stride of someone who had places to be and people to regulate. "Excuse me, officer," Maggie called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch that made neighborhood dogs whimper and grown men consider relocating to different zip codes. "I need to speak with you about the unauthorized parking situation on Elm Street. It's gotten completely out of hand." Deputy Williams blinked hard, wondering if the collision had scrambled his brain. "Ma'am, we just crashed. I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and I have been trying to reach your department for weeks about these violations." She gestured dismissively at the twisted metal around them. "This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior I've been warning everyone about. People driving too fast through our community." "You hit me," Deputy Williams said slowly, pushing against his jammed door. "You were speeding and you hit my patrol car." Maggie's perfectly applied lipstick curved into what might charitably be called a smile. "I was conducting official HOA business, which gives me certain privileges under municipal Code 127.3b. I'm sure you understand. There was no municipal code 127.3b. Maggie had made it up on the spot, just like she'd made up 17 other official regulations over her 3-year reign of terror as HOA president. But she delivered the lie with such unwavering confidence that Deputy Williams found himself actually wondering if such a code existed. "Ma'am, I need you to step back while I call this in," he said, finally forcing his door open with a screech of bent metal. "Actually, I need you to come with me right now," Maggie replied, pulling out her phone and starting to record. "Mrs. Patterson, at 847 Oak Street has painted her mailbox crimson instead of the approved burgundy, and according to our covenants, that requires immediate law enforcement intervention." Deputy Williams stared at her. In his 12 years of law enforcement, he'd dealt with drunk drivers, drug dealers, and once, memorably, a man who'd barricaded himself in a Walmart with nothing but pool noodles and a fierce determination to liberate the goldfish. But he'd never encountered anything quite like Margaret Thornfield. "Ma'am, we just had a vehicular collision. I need to..." "The collision can wait," Maggie interrupted, stepping closer with her phone held high. "This is a matter of community standards. Do you know what happens when one person gets away with crimson instead of burgundy? Anarchy. Complete and utter anarchy." Behind her, steam continued to rise from both vehicles. Mrs. Chen appeared on her front porch, took one look at her destroyed roses, and promptly went back inside to call her insurance company and possibly a priest. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put the phone down and provide me with your license and insurance information," Deputy Williams said, his voice taking on the careful tone officers used with people who might be having psychological episodes. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," Maggie replied, her tracksuit somehow still immaculate despite the crash. "I have personally filed over 2,300 violation notices in the past 18 months. I have successfully lobbied for noise ordinances that make ice cream trucks illegal after 6 p.m. I once had a family evicted because their Halloween decorations remained up until November 2nd. She leaned closer, and Deputy Williams caught a whiff of expensive perfume and barely contained rage. I know the mayor personally. I have the county commissioner's cell phone number, and I've memorized every subsection of the municipal housing code. What I need from you is cooperation, not bureaucracy. What you're going to get from me is a citation for reckless driving, failure to yield, and possibly reckless endangerment, Deputy Williams replied, finally finding his footing, literally and figuratively. Now step back and let me do my job. Maggie's eyes narrowed to slits that would have made a viper jealous. Your job is to serve and protect this community. That means enforcing the standards that keep property values high and undesirable elements out. I am not the problem here. Officer, I am the solution. The solution to what? Chaos, Maggie said simply. Do you see this neighborhood? Every lawn perfectly maintained, every house painted in approved colors, every driveway free of oil stains and unauthorized vehicles. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because someone, me, has the backbone to enforce standards. Deputy Williams looked around at the pristine suburban landscape, marred only by the spectacular crash scene they were currently standing in. Ma'am, with all due respect, you just crashed into a police car while speeding through your own neighborhood. I was responding to an emergency, Maggie shot back. The Hendersons at 423 Birch Street have installed a bird feeder that's 3 inches taller than regulation height. Every minute we waste here is another minute that unauthorized bird feeder corrupts the aesthetic integrity of our community. The deputy rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of what was going to be a legendary headache. There's no such thing as regulation bird feeder height. There is in our community, Maggie replied with absolute certainty. Page 47 of the Revised Covenants, subsection 12.7f. No external decorations, including but not limited to bird feeders, garden gnomes, and seasonal displays, may exceed 42 inches in height without written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. And who's on this Architectural Review Committee? Maggie smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing their masterpiece. Just me. Deputy Williams stared at her for a long moment. Ma'am, are you telling me that you are the sole member of the committee that approves all modifications to homes in this neighborhood? Someone has to maintain standards, Maggie said defensively. The previous board was far too lenient. They actually approved a purple front door. Purple! Can you imagine the precedent that would set? What happened to the previous board? They resigned, Maggie said with a slight smirk. After I filed formal complaints with the management company about their failure to enforce basic community standards. Apparently, they didn't appreciate my dedication to excellence. Deputy Williams was beginning to understand that he wasn't dealing with a simple traffic accident. This was something much more complex and potentially dangerous. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to... His radio crackled to life. Unit 23, we've got reports of a disturbance at Willowbrook Estates. Some kind of neighborhood dispute getting out of hand. Maggie's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. That's probably the situation on Elm Street I was telling you about. Mrs. Rodriguez has been parking her son's motorcycle in her driveway, which clearly violates the covenant regarding recreational vehicles. Unit 23, respond, the radio continued. Caller says there's a woman in a tracksuit threatening to call in airstrikes on non-compliant mailboxes. Deputy Williams looked at Maggie with new understanding. Ma'am, exactly how many neighbors have you been interacting with this morning? I started my rounds at 6 a.m., Maggie replied proudly. I've already documented 14 separate violations, issued preliminary warnings to 7 households, and scheduled follow-up inspections for this afternoon. It's not even 8 a.m. yet. Efficient governance requires early hours and unwavering dedication, Maggie said, straightening her tracksuit, with military precision. While everyone else is drinking coffee and reading newspapers, I'm out here protecting their property values. The radio crackled again. Unit 23, we've got another call. Same neighborhood. Caller reports a woman measuring the height of lawn. Sprinklers with a ruler and shouting about sprinkler tyranny. Deputy Williams closed his eyes and counted to 10. When he opened them, Maggie was filming him with her phone again. "I hope you're documenting how long this is taking," she said, sweetly. "Because while we're standing here discussing irrelevant traffic technicalities, Mrs. Patterson's crimson mailbox is continuing to violate community standards with every passing minute. Ma'am, put the phone down. Now. This is a public space. I have every right to—" "You're recording the scene of an accident involving a law enforcement officer. That's obstruction of justice." Maggie's expression shifted from smug to calculating. "Are you threatening me, officer? Because I should mention that I know my rights, and I know exactly who to call if those rights are violated." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm trying to process a traffic accident, and you're making that difficult. What's difficult is trying to maintain civilized society when people can't follow simple rules." Mag. Deputy Williams watched in growing alarm as the three tracksuit-clad women took their positions with military precision. Each carried identical clipboards, measuring tapes, and what appeared to be professional-grade cameras. More disturbing was the way they moved, like a coordinated unit that had drilled these movements dozens of times before. "Margaret," called the tallest of the three, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. "We have a situation developing on Elm Street. The Rodriguez family has called in reinforcements." Maggie's eyes lit up with excitement. "What kind of reinforcements, Linda?" Her brother-in-law, the one with the law degree. "Perfect," Maggie replied, rubbing her hands together. "I've been hoping for a chance to test our legal protocols." Deputy Williams stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need you to explain what's happening here, right now." "What's happening?" Maggie said, turning back to him with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, "is the systematic enforcement of community standards that have been ignored for far too long." She gestured to her colleagues. "Linda Kowalski, my vice president and head of architectural compliance, Janet Morrison, our landscape regulation specialist, and Beverly Chen, our parking and vehicle violation coordinator." "Wait," Deputy Williams said, looking at the third woman more closely. "Aren't you the owner of the rose garden we just crashed into?" Beverly Chen adjusted her glasses and consulted her clipboard. "The garden was planted without proper permits and contains several non-native species that violate our environmental compliance standards. The crash was actually quite convenient. It gives us grounds to require a complete landscape redesign using approved plants only." Deputy Williams stared at her. "Your own roses?" "Community standards apply to everyone equally," Beverly replied with the fervor of a true believer. "Personal preferences cannot be allowed to override collective property values." "This is insane," Deputy Williams muttered. "What's insane," Linda interjected, "is allowing people to think they can ignore legally binding covenants just because they find them inconvenient." She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be an extensive database. "Do you know how many violations we documented in this neighborhood last month alone? 217. Everything from garbage cans left out past pickup time to wind chimes that exceeded acceptable noise levels." "Wind chimes have noise levels?" Deputy Williams asked weakly. "Page 34 of the revised sound ordinance," Janet replied automatically. "No external noise-generating decorations may produce sounds exceeding 40 decibels as measured from the property line during designated quiet hours." "You measured the sound levels of wind chimes?" "We measured everything," Beverly said proudly. "Wind chimes, fountains, children's playground equipment, even the decorative flags that some residents thought they could hang without proper approval." Deputy Williams looked around at the four women, all of whom were regarding him with the expectant expressions of people waiting for praise. "Ladies, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't community governance. It's harassment." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Harassment?" Maggie repeated, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Officer, are you suggesting that enforcing legally binding agreements is harassment? I'm suggesting that measuring wind chimes and threatening your neighbors over mailbox colors might constitute—" His radio exploded with chatter. "Unit 23, we've got reports of escalation at Willowbrook Estates. Caller says there are now multiple women in tracksuits surrounding his house with measuring equipment. He's describing it as a suburban siege. That would be the Morrison residence, Janet said, consulting her tablet. Unauthorized deck extension, non-compliant outdoor furniture, and a bird bath that hasn't been approved by the architectural committee, which, as I mentioned, is just me, Maggie added helpfully. Another voice came over the radio. All units. We've got a caller reporting that women in tracksuits are now photographing his children's swing set and shouting about playground. Permit violations. Beverly looked up from her clipboard. The Henderson swing set is clearly visible from the street and exceeds the height restrictions for backyard recreational equipment. You're policing children's playground equipment? Deputy Williams asked. We're maintaining community standards, Linda replied firmly. Standards that everyone agreed to when they purchased their homes. Did everyone agree to having their children's toys measured and photographed? Everyone agreed to follow the covenants, Maggie said with increasing irritation. If they wanted to live somewhere without standards, they should have bought houses in neighborhoods without homeowners associations. Deputy Williams was beginning to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. This was an organized campaign of systematic intimidation. Ma'am, how long have you been conducting these enforcement activities? Full-scale coordinated enforcement began 18 months ago, Linda replied, consulting her tablet. After Margaret was elected president, and we realized how extensive the non-compliance problem had become. What happened 18 months ago? The four women exchanged glances that suggested they were sharing some kind of inside joke. The Great Gnome Incident, Beverly said solemnly. The what now? Maggie stepped forward, her expression taking on the reverent tone of someone recounting a foundational myth. Mrs. Patterson, the same Mrs. Patterson with the crimson mailbox, had installed a garden gnome on her front lawn. Not just any garden gnome, mind you. A gnome holding a tiny fishing pole positioned next to a miniature pond. That sounds charming? It was a clear violation of subsection 15.3a regarding lawn ornamentation, Janet said firmly. But when Margaret brought it to the attention of the previous board, they claimed it fell into a gray area of the regulations. A gray area? Maggie's voice rose with remembered outrage. A 3-foot-tall ceramic fisherman was somehow a gray area? What did you do? What any responsible community leader would do, Linda replied. Margaret called for an emergency board meeting to address the precedent this would set. And Beverly adjusted her glasses. They voted to allow the gnome to remain. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of historical injustice. That's when Margaret realized that the previous board lacked the vision and backbone necessary to maintain proper community standards, Janet continued. So she launched a campaign to educate residents about the importance of covenant compliance. What kind of campaign? Door-to-door information sessions, Maggie said proudly. I visited every home in the neighborhood to discuss the covenants and identify potential violations before they became major problems. Deputy Williams was starting to get a clearer picture. How did the neighbors respond to these information sessions? Most were very grateful, Linda replied quickly. They had no idea they were inadvertently violating community standards. And the ones who weren't grateful? The four women exchanged another look. Well, Maggie said slowly, some people are resistant to change, such as. The Hendersons initially claimed that our measurement of their fence height was incorrect, Beverly said. They actually hired a surveyor to dispute our findings. And the surveyor confirmed that our measurements were accurate to within a quarter inch, Janet added with satisfaction. The fence was indeed 3 inches too high. But instead of thanking us for identifying the violation, Linda continued, they filed a complaint with the management company claiming we were harassing them. Were you? We conducted 12 follow-up inspections to ensure compliance with the fence height adjustment, Maggie said defensively. That's not harassment, that's Thorough oversight. 12 inspections for a 3-inch fence violation. Standards are either enforced consistently or they become meaningless, Beverly replied with the certainty of someone quoting scripture. Deputy Williams's radio crackled again. Unit 23, we've got reports of residents barricading themselves inside their homes. Caller says women in tracksuits are now using measuring tapes on his mailbox post and photographing his porch light fixtures. The porch light is clearly non-compliant, Janet said, not looking up from her tablet. The fixture extends 4 inches beyond the approved profile for residential lighting. You have approved profiles for porch lights? Page 67 of the Architectural Guidelines, Maggie replied. All external lighting must conform to one of 12 pre-approved styles to maintain neighborhood aesthetic consistency. And who approved these 12 styles? The Architectural Review Committee, Linda said, which, as you know, is Margaret. Deputy Williams felt like he was trapped in some kind of suburban fever dream. Let me get this straight. You ladies have spent the last 18 months systematically measuring, photographing, and documenting every aspect of your neighbors' homes to ensure compliance with rules that one of you wrote. Not just wrote, Maggie corrected. Carefully researched, professionally, formatted, and democratically approved. By whom? By the residents of Willowbrook Estates during the special community meeting held 6 months after my election. How many people attended this meeting? The women looked uncomfortable for the first time. Well, Linda said slowly, it was held on a Tuesday evening during the school board meeting, and also during the city council meeting, Beverly added. 3 patrol cars and a supervisor's vehicle surrounded the crash scene within minutes, their occupants emerging to find what looked like a suburban standoff. Deputy Williams stood between the wreckage of 2 vehicles, while 4 women in tracksuits clustered together like a prayer circle of middle-class vigilantes. Sergeant Patricia Reeves, a 20-year veteran with the weathered expression of someone who'd seen everything suburban America could produce, approached the scene with the careful stride of a bomb disposal expert. Williams, what exactly am I looking at here? Sarge, this is... Deputy Williams paused, trying to figure out how to explain the situation without sounding like he'd suffered a severe head injury. This is Margaret Thornfield and what she calls her Community Standards Enforcement Division. Her what now? Maggie stepped forward, her tracksuit somehow still immaculate despite the morning's chaos. Sergeant Reeves, I'm the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and we've been conducting routine compliance inspections when this unfortunate traffic incident occurred. Sergeant Reeves looked at the twisted metal of both vehicles, then at the 4 women, then at Deputy Williams. Routine compliance inspections? We document covenant violations and ensure neighborhood standards are maintained, Linda added helpfully. It's completely legal under the HOA governing documents. Ma'am, we've received 17 separate calls this morning about harassment, trespassing, and what one resident described as tactical suburban warfare. Would you like to explain that? Before Maggie could answer, her phone rang. She glanced at the display and her face went from pale to ashen. That's the management company, she muttered. Answer it, Sergeant Reeves ordered. Maggie hesitated, then swiped to accept the call. This is Margaret Thornfield. Even from several feet away, Deputy Williams could hear the angry voice on the other end of the line. Maggie's expression grew more stricken with each passing second. I understand, she said finally. Yes, I'll be there. This afternoon. With my attorney. She hung up and looked at her enforcement team with the expression of someone who'd just received very bad news. What did they say? Beverly asked. They're suspending all HOA enforcement activities pending a full investigation, Maggie said quietly. Effective immediately. What? Janet practically shrieked. They can't do that. They can and they did, Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Apparently, they've been receiving complaints for months, not just from residents, but from city officials, county supervisors, and... She swallowed hard. The State Attorney General's office. Sergeant Reeves stepped closer. The State Attorney General? Ma'am, what exactly have you been doing in this neighborhood? Linda pulled out her tablet, scrolling through screens of data. We've been maintaining detailed records of all violations, conducting regular inspections, and ensuring compliance with community standards. Everything we've done is documented and legally justified. Show me, Sergeant Reeves ordered. Linda handed over the tablet, and Sergeant Reeves began scrolling through what appeared to be hundreds of entries. Her expression grew more troubled with each screen. Ma'am, this shows inspections of people's backyards without their permission, photos taken through windows, measurements of private property conducted without homeowner consent. She looked up at the four women. How exactly did you gain access to all of this private property? The women exchanged glances. Well, Beverly began slowly, most people weren't home during the day, so you trespassed. We conducted inspections. Janet corrected. The covenants give us the right to ensure compliance. The covenants give you the right to enter people's private property without permission. They give us the right to verify that community standards are being maintained, Maggie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sergeant Reeves continued scrolling through the tablet. I'm seeing entries here about measuring the height of children's playground equipment, photographing the contents of people's garages, and, she paused, frowning, documenting the breed of pets visible in backyard areas. Certain breeds are restricted under the pet policy, Linda explained. You've been surveilling people's pets? We've been ensuring compliance with established regulations. Deputy Williams' radio crackled to life. All units, we have a situation developing at Willowbrook Estates. Multiple residents are now gathered in the street demanding protection from what they're calling the tracksuit mafia. Sergeant Reeves looked up from the tablet with an expression that suggested she was rapidly losing patience. The tracksuit mafia? That's what Mr. Henderson called us, Beverly admitted quietly. But only after we documented 17 separate violations on his property. 17 violations? On one property? Maggie straightened slightly, some of her earlier confidence returning. The Henderson residence was flagged as a high-priority compliance concern. Unauthorized fence modifications, non-compliant landscaping, improper storage of recreational vehicles, and multiple architectural violations. Such as? Their mailbox post was painted forest green instead of approved hunter green, Janet replied. The difference is clearly visible in proper lighting conditions. Sergeant Reeves stared at her. You cited someone for having the wrong shade of green on their mailbox? Color consistency is fundamental to maintaining property values, Linda said defensively. When people start choosing their own colors instead of following approved palettes, it creates visual chaos that can impact the entire neighborhood's market appeal. Market appeal, Sergeant Reeves repeated slowly. Ma'am, are you telling me that you've been harassing your neighbors over paint colors because you're worried about property values? We haven't harassed anyone, Maggie snapped, her defensive instincts kicking back in. We've provided educational opportunities and compliance guidance to help residents understand their covenant obligations. Educational opportunities like taking photos through their windows. We documented visible violations from public vantage points. By climbing on their fences and using telephoto lenses, the four women fell silent. Ladies, Sergeant Reeves said, with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to children, taking photographs of the interior of people's homes without their permission is called invasion of privacy. Entering their property without consent is called trespassing. Threatening them with legal action over minor aesthetic choices is called harassment. But the covenants? Maggie began. The covenants don't override state and federal laws, Sergeant Reeves interrupted. And they certainly don't give you the right to conduct surveillance operations on your neighbors. Another patrol car pulled up, and Deputy Williams watched as Officer Martinez emerged with what appeared to be a very agitated middle-aged man in a bathrobe. "Sarge!" Officer Martinez called out. "This is Mr. Henderson. He's the one who called about the surveillance activities." Mr. Henderson stormed over to the group, pointing an accusatory finger at Maggie. "That woman has been stalking my family for months. She hides in bushes to photograph our backyard. She measures our fence at different times of day to see if it settles into violation territory. And yesterday, I caught her going through our garbage to document what she called inappropriate waste disposal practices." "You were going through people's garbage?" Sergeant Reeves asked. "Garbage placed at curbside becomes public property," Beverly replied quickly. "We were simply verifying compliance with recycling regulations." "What recycling regulations?" "The ones outlined in the environmental compliance addendum that was approved during the February community meeting." "How many people attended the February community meeting?" Another uncomfortable silence. "4, Janet finally admitted. "The same 4 people who are standing here right now." "Democratic governance requires active participation," Maggie said weakly. Mr. Henderson threw up his hands. "They voted themselves the authority to go through our trash. My 8-year-old daughter is afraid to play in our own backyard because she thinks the fence ladies are going to measure her swing set and take it away." "We would never remove private property," Linda protested. "We would simply issue citations, requiring compliance modifications." "You'd make a child tear down her swing set because it's too tall?" "Community standards apply to all residents regardless of age," Beverly replied with the mechanical precision of someone reciting a mantra. "Sergeant." Reeves closed the tablet and handed it back to Linda. "Ladies, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't community governance. It's a coordinated harassment campaign that appears to have crossed multiple legal lines." "We were protecting the community," Maggie insisted, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. "From what? Children's playground equipment? The wrong shade of green paint? Wind chimes?" "From chaos," Maggie replied, and for the first time, Deputy Williams heard something desperate in her voice. "Do you know what happens when standards slip? When people think they can do whatever they want with their property, they live their lives? They destroy property values. They create visual pollution. They turn neighborhoods into... Maggie struggled for words, her perfectly composed facade finally beginning to crack. "Into what, ma'am?" "Into the kind of place where people don't take pride in their homes," Maggie whispered. "The kind of place where everything is just mediocre." Sergeant Reeves studied Maggie. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. By 7 p.m., every seat was occupied. People lined the walls, and overflow crowds gathered on the sidewalk outside. News vans from 3 local stations had set up in the parking lot after word spread about the HOA enforcement crisis that had consumed social media throughout the day. Margaret Thornfield sat in the front row, flanked by her 3 former enforcement team members and 2 attorneys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Gone were the military precision tracksuits, replaced by conservative business attire that somehow made them look smaller and more vulnerable. James Kowalski, Linda's husband, sat several rows behind them, staring at his wife's back with an expression of bewildered hurt. Throughout their 23-year marriage, he'd watched Linda transform from the woman who used to leave Christmas decorations up until March into someone who measured neighbors' hedge heights with a ruler. He'd assumed it was just a phase, a way to channel her organizational energy after their youngest child left for college. He'd never imagined it would lead to this. The community center buzzed with conversations that ranged from angry to incredulous to oddly relieved. For months, residents had whispered among themselves about the increasingly aggressive enforcement activities, but few had realized the scope of what was happening until the morning's events brought everything into the open. Sarah, Chen, Beverly's daughter-in-law, sat near the back with her 2 young children. Her 5-year-old kept asking why Grandma Beverly looked so sad, while her 8-year-old wanted to know if they were in trouble for having the wrong kind of flowers. Sarah had spent the afternoon trying to explain to her children that sometimes grown-ups made mistakes, but she was struggling to understand how Beverly, the woman who'd taught her to garden, who'd babysat the kids countless times, who'd always seemed so sensible, had become part of something so destructive. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Patricia Williams, the management company representative, took the podium. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, she surveyed the packed room with professional composure. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying easily through the space. "I'm Patricia Williams with Covenant Community Management, and I want to thank everyone for attending tonight's emergency meeting. I know this has been a difficult day for everyone in the Willowbrook Estates community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Before we begin, I want to make one thing absolutely clear," Williams continued. "The enforcement activities that have been conducted by certain residents over the past 18 months were not authorized by this management company, were not conducted according to proper HOA governance procedures, and in many cases appear to have violated both community covenants and state laws." The murmur grew louder, with several people calling out, "About time! And we tried to tell you!" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes boring into the back of her head. The weight of collective judgment was crushing in a way that measuring wind chimes and documenting mailbox violations had never prepared her for. "With that said," Williams continued, raising her voice to restore order, "we're here tonight to address the situation constructively and determine how to move forward as a community. I want to begin by giving residents an opportunity to share their experiences with the unauthorized enforcement activities." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hands shot up throughout the room, people stood from their seats, and voices began overlapping as neighbors who'd been silent for months suddenly found their courage. "One at a time, please," Williams called out. "Mr. Henderson, you had your hand up first." Tom Henderson stood up, still wearing the same bathrobe he'd had. On that morning, though, he'd added shoes and a baseball cap. "Thank you. I just want everyone to understand what's been happening to families in this neighborhood. My 8-year-old daughter has been having nightmares about the fence ladies for 3 months. She's afraid to play in our backyard because she thinks they're going to take away her swing set." His voice cracked slightly. "Yesterday she asked me if we were bad people because our mailbox was the wrong color. My 8-year-old asked me if we were bad people." The room fell silent except for the soft sound of Margaret crying. Henderson continued, "I want those 4 women to understand that their community standards have terrorized my child, that their property value protection has made my daughter afraid of her own home." He sat down to scattered applause and supportive murmurs. Williams nodded gravely. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Rodriguez?" Elena Rodriguez stood up, clutching a folder of papers. "I brought documentation of every interaction I've had with the so-called enforcement team over the past year. 47 separate visits to my property. 47 times they found something wrong with my home, my yard, my parking, or my family's activities." She held up the folder. "They cited me for my son's motorcycle being visible from the street. They cited me for hanging laundry on a clothesline in my own backyard. They cited me for having a vegetable garden with non-approved plants. They even cited me for having a bird feeder that attracted non-native species." Rodriguez's voice grew stronger as she spoke. But the worst part wasn't the citations. It was the constant feeling of being watched, of being judged, of never knowing when. "I'd come home to find someone in my backyard with a measuring tape and a camera." She looked directly at Margaret. "You made me afraid to live in my own home. You made my family feel like criminals for existing in our own space." More applause, louder this time. Williams called on speaker after speaker, and the stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic harassment that had escalated far beyond anything the community had imagined. Residents described finding members of the enforcement team in their backyards at dawn, photographing through windows, measuring everything from fence posts to flower pot heights to the precise positioning of garbage cans. Mrs. Patterson, the woman with the infamous crimson mailbox, stood to describe how Margaret had knocked on her door at 6:30 a.m. to inform her that her mailbox color was creating visual discord that could impact neighborhood property values by up to 3%. 3%, Mrs. Patterson repeated. She had calculated that my mailbox color would decrease everyone's home values by 3%. When I asked to see her research, she handed me a printout of a blog post from something called Neighborhood. Aesthetics Quarterly. Scattered laughter broke through the tension in the room. But it wasn't funny when she started parking across from my house to photograph my mailbox at different times of day to document how the color looked in various lighting conditions. My neighbors started asking if I was under investigation for something. As the testimonies continued, a clear pattern emerged. The enforcement team hadn't just been overzealous. They'd been conducting what amounted to surveillance operations on their own neighbors, creating detailed files on every aspect of residents' private lives under the guise of covenant compliance. James Morrison, Janet's husband, finally stood up. I want to apologize to everyone in this room. I knew my wife was involved in HOA activities, but I had no idea about the scope of what was happening. I thought she was just, I don't know, organizing volunteer cleanups or something. He looked back at Janet, who was staring at her hands. When I found out this morning that she'd been photographing people through their windows and going through their garbage, I don't even know who she's become. The pain in his voice was evident to everyone in the room. Janet used to be the person who baked cookies for new neighbors. Now I find out she's been terrorizing those same neighbors over the height of their hedge trimming. Williams let the testimonies continue for nearly an hour before calling for a break. During the intermission, Margaret remained in her seat while her former enforcement team members were surrounded by their families, conversations that ranged from heated to heartbroken as spouses and children tried to understand how the women they thought they knew had become part of something so destructive. Beverly Chen found herself face to face with her daughter-in-law, Sarah, who was holding both grandchildren close. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, "Emma has been asking why you took pictures of her playhouse. She thinks she did something wrong." Beverly looked down at her 5-year-old granddaughter, who was peeking out from behind her mother's leg with uncertain eyes. "Emma, sweetheart," Beverly began, but the little girl shrank back further. "She doesn't understand," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "She just knows that Grandma was doing something that made Mommy and Daddy upset. She thinks you don't love her anymore because her playhouse was against the rules." Beverly knelt down, trying to get to Emma's eye level, but the child turned away. "Oh, God," Beverly whispered. "What have I done to my own granddaughter?" Meanwhile, Linda found herself confronting her husband James in the hallway outside the meeting room. 23 years, he said quietly. 23 years of marriage. And I don't recognize the woman I'm married to. James, I was trying to protect our investment. Our investment? His voice rose slightly. Linda, you've been stalking our neighbors. You've been taking pictures through people's windows. You've been terrorizing. 3 weeks after the community meeting, FBI Special Agent Maria Santos sat in her Denver field office reviewing what had initially seemed like a routine complaint about HOA harassment, but had evolved into something much more complex and disturbing. "Tell me again how this crossed federal lines," she said to Detective Ray Morrison from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. "Initially, it didn't," Morrison replied, setting down a thick file folder. "But when we started digging into the enforcement team's activities, we found some interesting connections." He opened the folder to reveal photographs, financial records, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. It turns out Margaret Thornfield wasn't just running a neighborhood watch program. She was running a sophisticated intelligence operation with ties to at least 12 other HOA communities across 3 states. Agent Santos leaned forward. "Explain that." The enforcement team's methods weren't just overzealous, they were professional. Too professional for 4 suburban housewives to develop independently. Morrison pulled out a series of photographs showing high-end surveillance equipment. Hidden cameras, long-range listening devices, commercial-grade telephoto lenses, and software for analyzing property records and financial data. Where did they get this equipment? That's where it gets interesting. Morrison flipped to another section of the file. The purchases were made through a company called Community Standard Solutions, LLC. When we traced the ownership, we found connections to a network of HOA management companies that specialize in what they call aggressive compliance enforcement. Agent Santos studied the financial records. So someone was funding this operation? More than that. Someone was training them. Morrison pulled out printed emails and training materials. We found correspondence showing that Thornfield and her team attended weekend seminars on advanced community compliance techniques and legal surveillance methods for property management. Who was running these seminars? A former FBI agent named Robert Kessler, who was forced out of the Bureau in 2019 for conducting unauthorized surveillance operations on private citizens. Agent Santos felt the familiar tingle that came with a case suddenly becoming much more serious. What kind of unauthorized surveillance? Kessler was part of a task force investigating financial crimes, but he began using Bureau resources to conduct personal investigations of his neighbors, his ex-wife, and eventually anyone he perceived as not meeting his standards of community integrity. Morrison continued flipping through the file. After he was terminated, Kessler started Community Standard Solutions as a consulting firm. He recruits HOA presidents and board members who share his obsession with control and trains them in surveillance techniques that skirt the edge of legality. How many communities are we talking about? So far, we've identified 47 HOAs across Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah that have contracted with Kessler's company. All of them have had dramatic increases in enforcement activities, resident complaints, and legal disputes. Agent Santos stood up and began pacing. So we're not dealing with 4 women who got carried away with neighborhood rules. We're dealing with a network of trained operatives conducting coordinated surveillance operations on American citizens. That's what it looks like, Morrison confirmed. And there's more. The surveillance data collected by these HOA teams isn't just being used for covenant enforcement. It's being compiled into detailed profiles of residents' daily activities, financial status, political affiliations, and personal relationships. For what purpose? We're still investigating, but we've found evidence that the data is being sold to marketing companies, political organizations, and, in some cases, entities that we haven't been able to identify yet. Agent Santos stopped pacing. Show me the Willowbrook evidence. Morrison pulled out Margaret's tablet, now being held as evidence. This device contained over 10,000 photographs of residents and their property, detailed floor plans of homes obtained through window surveillance, financial records accessed through illegal means, and even transcripts of private conversations, recorded without consent. He scrolled through screens of data. Margaret Thornfield had compiled profiles on every resident of Willowbrook Estates that included their work schedules, shopping patterns, social relationships, political yard signs, subscription services, vehicle usage patterns, and even estimates of household income based on observed purchasing behavior. This goes way beyond HOA enforcement. Way beyond. And it gets worse. Morrison pulled up another file. We found evidence that Thornfield was specifically targeting residents who might be vulnerable to financial pressure, recent divorcees, people who'd lost jobs, families with medical issues, and recommending them for what Kessler's organization calls intensive compliance management. Which means systematic harassment designed to force them to sell their homes at below market prices to preferred buyers. Agent Santos felt a chill. Preferred buyers meaning? Real estate investment companies with financial ties to Kessler's network. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear. This wasn't just an overzealous HOA situation. It was an organized criminal enterprise using neighborhood surveillance to identify and exploit vulnerable homeowners. "What about the other members of Thornfield's enforcement team?" Agent Santos asked. Linda Kowalski appears to have been genuinely motivated by property value concerns, but she was being fed targeting information by Thornfield. Janet Morrison and Beverly Chen were recruited after their own homes were subjected to intensive surveillance and harassment. Classic recruitment through coercion. Morrison pulled out transcripts of recorded conversations. "We have evidence that Thornfield threatened to have all 3 women's homes cited for violations that would require expensive modifications unless they agreed to join the enforcement team. So she was blackmailing her own neighbors into helping her conduct surveillance on other neighbors." Exactly. "And based on the training materials we found, this appears to be the standard recruitment model across all 47 communities we've identified." Agent Santos returned to her desk and opened her laptop. "I need to contact the U.S. Attorney's office. This has evolved from a harassment complaint to a potential RICO case." "There's one more thing," Morrison said. "We've been monitoring Margaret Thornfield's communications since her arrest. She's been contacted by multiple attorneys claiming to represent community standard solutions, all offering to pay her legal fees if she agrees to certain conditions." "What conditions?" "She refuses to cooperate with law enforcement, takes full responsibility for all surveillance activities, and maintains that she acted independently without outside guidance or support. In other words, they want her to be the fall guy for the entire operation." "That's how it looks, but there's something else you should know about Margaret Thornfield." Agent Santos looked up from her laptop. "What's that?" "She's been secretly recording her conversations with the defense attorneys." Morrison pulled out a small digital recorder. "She came to us 3 days ago, said she realized she'd been used, and she wants to help us shut down the entire network." "Why the change of heart?" "Her granddaughter asked her why she'd been so mean to their neighbors. Margaret said that moment made her realize she'd become someone she didn't recognize, and she wanted to make sure no other communities went through what Willowbrook Estates had experienced." Agent Santos considered this development. "Is she credible?" "We've verified several of her claims independently, and she's provided us with access to communications and training materials that we wouldn't have been able to obtain otherwise." "What kind of training materials?" Morrison: